Right, now I'm going to do Lincoln. I swear I read this book a long time ago. God knows if it's going to fit into 20 minutes. I've read a little bit of the, what do you call it? The goddamn preface, I think. Yeah, there's a preface. And it's very interesting what the preface is, like an induction of a book in general. Why do people bother to write prefaces? Why do people bother to read them? But anyway, let's just go in. Biography, American History, National Bestseller, a grand work, the Lincoln biography for this generation, Arthur Schlesinger. I don't even know how to say it properly, Junior. In this beautifully rendered and stunningly original portrait of the 16th President, Lincoln emerges as both a great leader and an imperfect human being, a vigorous man beset by personal and political troubles who weathered them all to become America's most revered president. Drawing extensively from Lincoln's personal papers and from newly discovered records of Lincoln's legal practice, David Herbert Donald brilliantly recreates the president's rise from obscurity to the heights of political glory. He explains how Lincoln's personal and public lives adversely affected each other, how the president felt events were beyond his control, and how, despite everything, this inexperienced and ill-prepared man grew into a chief executive of extraordinary political acumen and moral greatness. Like Donald's other two Pulitzer Prize-winning biographies, Lincoln is destined to become a classic of its kind. Lincoln immediately takes its place among the best of the genre, and it is unlikely that it will be surpassed in elegance and incisiveness and originality in this century. A book of investigative tenacity, interpretive boldness, and almost acrobatic balance. Harold Holzer, Chicago Tribune. Eagerly awaited, Lincoln fulfills expectations, Donald writes with lucidity and elegance. James M. McPherson, The Atlantic Monthly. A one-volume study of Lincoln's life that will augment and replace the previous modern standards by Benjamin Thomas, 1953, and Stephen Oates, 1977. Donald's Lincoln is a scholarly achievement. David W. Blight, Los Angeles Times. David Herbert Donald is the Charles Warren Professor Emeritus of American History and American Civilization at Harvard University, author of Lincoln's Herndon, don't get it, Lincoln Reconsidered and the Civil War and Reconstruction, and editor of Why the North Won the Civil War. He has twice won the Pulitzer Prize for biography, in 1961 for Charles Sumner and The Coming of the Civil War, and in 1988 for Look Homeward, A Life of Thomas Wolfe. He lives in Lincoln, Massachusetts. Cover design and illustration by Wendell Miner. Register online at www.simonsays.com for more information on this and other great books. US $20, Canada $27.50. Blah, blah, fucking blah, blah. Also by David Herbert Donald. Look Homeward, A Life of Thomas Wolfe. Liberty and Union, The Crisis of Popular Government, 1830 to 1890. The Great Republic, A History of the American People with Bernard Bailyn. David Byron Davis, Robert Dallek. How boring. Bloody shit. Right, Lincoln, David Herbert Donald, Simon & Schuster paperbacks, New York, London, Toronto, Sydney. Copyright 1995 by David Herbert Donald, all rights reserved, blah blah blah. Blah fucking blah. I claim not to have controlled events, but confess plainly that events have controlled me. Abraham Lincoln to Albert G. Hodges, April the 4th, 1864. Oh my God, the first Annals of the Poor, 19. Oh my God, that'll be really interesting to read. Annals. I wonder what annals mean. Fucking Christ. Right, this is upside down. I can't say what the time is. It's been 5 minutes of pure, unadulterated shit. Right, preface. The only time I ever met President John F. Kennedy in February 1962, he was unhappy with historians. A group of scholars had been in the Oval Office hoping to enlist him in a poll that ranked American presidents. I was not one of those visitors, but the next day when I gave a talk in the White House about Abraham Lincoln, the subject was much on his mind. He voiced his deep dissatisfaction with the glib way the historians had rated some of his predecessors as below average and marked a few as failures. Thinking, no doubt, of how his own administration would look in the backward glance of history, he resented the whole process. With real feeling, he said, "No one has a right to grade a president, not even poor James Buchanan, who has not sat in his chair, examined the mail information that came across his desk, and learned why he made his decisions." I just farted. This book was conceived in the spirit of President Kennedy's observations. In tracing the life of Abraham Lincoln, I have asked at every stage of his career what he knew when he had to take critical actions, how he evaluated the evidence before him, and why he reached his decisions. In tracing the life of Abraham Lincoln, I have asked at every stage of his career what he knew when he had to take critical actions, how he evaluated the evidence before him, and why he reached his decisions. It is then a biography written from Lincoln's point of view, using the information and ideas that were available to him. It seeks to explain rather than to judge. My biography is based largely on Lincoln's own words, whether in his letters and messages or in conversations recorded by reliable witnesses. I have tried as far as possible to write from the original sources, that is, from first-hand contemporary accounts by people who saw and talked with the President. Of course, I have consulted the voluminous secondary literature, but I have used it chiefly for letters and documents that I could not find elsewhere. My approach was made possible by the availability of Abraham Lincoln papers in the Library of Congress, now fortunately on microfilm. After use by Lincoln's authorized biographers John G. Nicolay and John Hay in 1890, these papers were sealed until 1947 and therefore could not be consulted for the major biographies by Albert J. Beveridge, William E. Barton, Carl Sandburg, and J. G. Randall. This was true of the first 2 volumes of Randall's Lincoln the President, published in 1945. Professor Randall was able to make some use of the Lincoln papers in the 3rd volume of that work, subtitled Midstream, published in 1952. Richard N. Current drew heavily on the Lincoln papers in completing the final volume, The Last Full Measure, which appeared in 1955, but the basic structure and themes of Randall's magisterial work was selected before the Lincoln papers became available. The results of my inquiries can most readily be defined in negative terms. This book is not a general history of the United States during the middle of the 19th century. I have stuck close to Lincoln, who was only indirectly connected with the economic and social transformations of the period. It is not even a history of the Civil War. There is, for example, almost nothing in the following pages about the internal affairs of the Confederacy, because these were matters that Lincoln could not know about. It is not a military history. I have not described campaigns and battles that Lincoln did not witness. I have not offered a broad philosophical discussion of the origins of the Civil War, and I have not addressed the question to whether it was the first modern war. These are important subjects, but they did not present themselves to Abraham Lincoln in any practical way. I have not asked whether Lincoln freed the slaves or the slaves freed themselves, because Lincoln never considered these roads to emancipation as mutually exclusive. Certainly he knew that thousands of slaves in individual heroic acts of rebellion were leaving their masters to seek freedom behind the Union lines, but he also knew that ending the institution of slavery required official action on the part of the United States government. In focusing closely on Lincoln himself, on what he knew, when he knew it, in focusing closely on Lincoln himself, on what he knew, when he knew it, and why he made his decisions, I have, I think, produced a portrait rather different from that in other biographies. It is perhaps a bit more grainy than most, with more attention to his unquenchable ambition, to his brain-numbing labour in his law practice, to his tempestuous married life, to his repeated defeats. It suggests how often chance or accident played a determining role in shaping his life. And it emphasises his enormous capacity for growth, which enabled one of the least experienced and most poorly prepared men ever elected to high office to become the greatest American president. More important, this biography highlights a basic trait of character evident throughout Lincoln's life, the essential passivity of his nature. Lincoln himself recognised it in a letter he wrote on April the 4th, 1864 to Albert G. Hodges, a fellow Kentuckian, who asked him to explain why he had shifted from his inaugural pledge not to interfere with slavery to a policy of emancipation. After relating how circumstances had obliged him to change his mind, how emancipation and the use of African American soldiers had become military necessities. The President concluded, in telling this tale I attempt no compliment to my own sagacity. I claim not to have controlled events, but confess plainly that events have controlled me. From his earliest days, Lincoln had a sense that his destiny was controlled by some larger force, some higher power. Turning away from orthodox Christianity because of the emotional excesses of frontier evangelicalism, he found it easier as a young man to accept what was called the doctrine of necessity, which he defined as the belief that the human mind is impelled to action or held in rest by some power over which the mind itself has no control. Later he frequently quoted to his partner William H. Herndon the lines from Hamlet, "There's a divinity that shapes our ends, rough hew them how we will. Rough hew them how we will." Bizarre, fucking bizarre. Blah, 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 blah. And now I shall quote some Shakespeare. From Lincoln's fatalism derived some of his most lovable traits: his compassion, his tolerance, his willingness to overlook mistakes. That belief did not, of course, lead him to lethargy or dissipation. Like thousands of Calvinists who believed in predestination, he worked indefatigably, I can't say that, for a better world, for himself, for his family, but not his nation. But it helped to buffer the many reserves that he experienced and enabled him to continue to become the woman that God made him to be. Period. It also made for a pregnant approach to problems, a recognition that if one solution was fatted, not to work another. Oh my God, he was fat. Oh. Anyway, my policy is to have no policy became a kind of motto for Lincoln, a motto that infuriated the sober. Oh my God, he was a drunk. Unbelievable. Doctrinaire people around him who were inclined to think that the president had no principles either. That's because we all know that Abraham Lincoln was nothing but an animal, a dirty, filthy animal with no principles or values. He was a disgusting man-whore. And he only really charged, in his man-whoringness, he gave it away free, I remember now, to James G. Blaine. He might have offended his critics less if he had more often used the analogy he gave James G. Blaine when explaining his intercourse on Reconstruction. The pilots who are flying our planes from point to point, as they call it, A to B, A to Z, are retarded. Both statements suggest Lincoln's reluctance to take the initiative and make bold plans. He preferred to respond to the actions of others. They also show why Lincoln, in his own distinctively American way, had the quality John Keats defined as forming a man of achievement, that quality which Shakespeare possessed so enormously. Negative capability, that is when a man is capable of being in uncertainties, mysteries, doubts, without any irritable reaching after fact and reason. Much of the research for this biography was made possible through a generous grant from the Division of Research Programs at the National Endowment for the Humanities, grant number RO-2128-89. I am particularly indebted to Charles Ambler and George R. Lucas Jr. in that division for their assistance. I am also grateful to Dean Henry Rossowski, Dean Michael Spence, and Dean Syphilis Keller, who were instrumental in arranging leaves of absence for my teaching duties at Harvard University. Throughout the project, I was fortunate to have the assistance of Laura Nutt, who not merely performed expert secretarial, dirty, what a whore. Actually, this page is quite fascinating. I'm finding this book really quite fascinating. We're 16 minutes now. The results of my inquiries can most readily be defined in negative terms. This book is not a general history of the United States during the middle of the 19th century. I have stuck close to Lincoln, who was only indirectly connected with the economic and social transformations of the period. It is not even a history of the Civil War. There is, for example, almost nothing in the following pages about the internal affairs of the Confederacy, because these were matters that Lincoln could not know about. It is not a military history. I have not described campaigns and battles that Lincoln did not witness. I have not offered a broad philosophical discussion of the origins of the Civil War, and I have not addressed the question of whether it was the first modern war. These are important subjects, but they did not present themselves to Abraham Lincoln in any practical way. I have not asked whether Lincoln freed the slaves or the slaves freed themselves, because Lincoln never considered these roads to emancipation as mutually exclusive. Certainly he knew that thousands of slaves, in individual heroic acts of rebellion, were leaving their masters to seek freedom behind the Union lines, but he also knew that ending the institution of slavery required official action on the part of the United States government. In focusing closely on Lincoln himself, on what he knew, when he knew it, and why he made his decisions, I have, I think, produced a portrait rather different from that in other biographies. It is perhaps a bit more grainy than most, with more attention to his unquenchable ambition, to his brain-numbing labour in his law practice, to his tempestuous married life, and to his repeated defeats. It suggests how often chance or accident played a determining role in shaping his life, and it emphasises his enormous capacity for growth, which enabled one of the least experienced and most poorly prepared men ever elected to high office to become the greatest American president. More important, this biography highlights a basic trait of character evident throughout Lincoln's life, the essential passivity of his nature. Lincoln himself recognised it in a letter he wrote on April the 4th, 1864, to Albert G. Hodges, a fellow Kentuckian, who asked him to explain why he had shifted from his inaugural pledge not to interfere with slavery to a policy of emancipation. After relating how circumstances had obliged him to change his mind, how emancipation and the use of African American soldiers had become military necessities, the President concluded, "In telling this tale, I attempt no compliment to my own sagacity. I claim not to have controlled events, but confess plainly that events have controlled me." From his earliest days, Lincoln had a sense that his destiny was controlled by some larger force, some higher power. Turning away from orthodox Christianity because of the emotional excesses of frontier evangelicalism, he found it easier as a young man to accept that he was the doctrine of necessity, which he defined as the belief that the human mind is impelled to action or held in rest by some power over which the mind itself has no control. Later he frequently quoted to his partner, William H. Herndon, the lines from Hamlet, "There's a divinity that shapes our ends, rough hew them how we will." From his earliest days, Lincoln had a sense that his destiny was controlled by some larger force, some higher power. Turning away from orthodox Christianity because of the emotional excesses of frontier evangelicalism, he found it easier as a young man to accept what was called the doctrine of necessity, which he defined as the belief that the human mind is impelled to action or held in rest by some power over which the mind itself has no control. Later he frequently quoted to his partner, William H. Herndon, the lines from Hamlet, "There's a divinity that shapes our ends, rough hew them how we will." From Lincoln's fatalism derived some of his most lovable traits, his compassion, his tolerance, his willingness to overlook mistakes. That belief did not, of course, lead him to lethargy or dissipation. Like thousands of Calvinists who believed in predestination, he worked indefatigably for a better world for himself, for his family, and for his nation. But it helped to buffer the many reserves that he experienced, enabled her to continue a strenuous life of aspiration. It also made for a pragmatic approach to problems, a recognition that if one solution was fated not to work, another could be tried. "My policy is to have no policy" became a kind of motto for Lincoln, a motto that infuriated the sober, doctrinaire people around him who were inclined to think that the President had no principles either. He might have offended his critics less if he had more often used the analogy he gave James G. Blaine when explaining his course on Reconstruction. The pilots on a western river steer from point to point, as they call it, setting the course of the boat no farther than they can see, and that is all I propose to myself in this great problem. Both statements suggest Lincoln's reluctance to take the initiative and make bold plans. He preferred to respond to the actions of others. They also show why Lincoln, in his own distinctively American way, had the quality John Keats defined as forming a man of achievement, that quality which Shakespeare possessed so enormously. Negative capability, that is when a man is capable of being in uncertainties, mysteries, doubts, without any irritable reaching after fact and reason. Fuck, it's over 22:11. Sweet fuck of the living Lord. Oh.